But the first thing I wanted to talk about was just sort of an interesting thing. I'm not much of a John Kennedy assassination expert, but I am a fan of the Antiques Roadshow, and I was watching that this weekend, and all of a sudden they're interviewing some woman who was in the White House press office with JFK, and she must have been pretty young at the time because she's still alive today, 60 years later practically. And she's talking about how her collection she's got the actual press schedule from the day Kennedy was shot. Showing all the events, including the lunch he was supposed to arrive at, but obviously didn't because then he was shot and killed. And she's talking about it, and he asks her, the antique expert, about, where were you that day? And she says, I was on Air Force One. And he says, oh wow, and what happened? Well, we ended up having to, I took the backup plane because I was the president's staff, but he died, so Lyndon Johnson, who then became president, immediately needed his staff because it was his Air Force One, right? So they didn't want Kennedy's staff hanging around. She said a little thing about her flight back that I did a double take. The antique dealer kind of went, oh, and then he moved on like nothing had happened. And I went back to my TV and played it again and went, did I just hear what I thought I heard? I mean, basically she said, I flew back on the backup plane. We went with the Texas delegation, and depending on the use of the terminology, Texas delegation usually means congressional delegation, meaning all the congressmen and senators, from Texas. But it could also mean the delegation of Texas officials flying back to Washington with Johnson, who now became president, right? So we don't quite know if she means members of Congress, staff, governor's staff, who knows? But it's official Texas government personnel she means, and possibly federal. And she says, and it was a very unpleasant flight because a number of them were a little bit happy about it on the way back. Basically saying they were a little bit happy that Kennedy was shot and killed. And I heard that, I was like, oh my God. And I mean, Again, I'm not a Kennedy expert, so I was not aware of that. I took a clip, put it on Twitter anyway, thinking maybe I'm not the only one who hasn't heard this before. And it really went far. I think Jake Tapper at CNN had retweeted it. A number of journalist friends of mine, everyone thought it was really interesting. And I did have one guy respond, and maybe he was telling the truth. He was sort of angry at it. He thought I was making it partisan, and I said, I didn't say Republicans or Democrats. I just said Texas delegation. He said the Texas delegation back then was a lot of Democrats, which it may have been. Mind you, early 60s, a lot of Democrats were Democrats who then became Republicans, because remember, the Democratic Party started liking blacks and Republicans were like, meh. But it doesn't really matter. The point was that you had that kind of animosity back then, that the president would literally have his head blown off and people would be like, yeah. Even with Trump, like, I don't want an assassination, for a number of reasons. I mean, A, it's just not very nice, but B, that's not the kind of thing you want happening in our political culture, because once things like that happen, more things like that happen. It's one of the reasons, it's the main reason I worry about Donald Trump. Well, there's a lot of reasons I worry about Donald Trump, but one of them is he's establishing a new culture of behavior where, guess what? Next time an accused pedophile runs, people are going to go on the Republican side, who cares? We did it once and there was nothing to pay for it, right? He's breaking down barriers. All the Nazi garbage, that he's been sucking up to the alt-right neo-Nazis, all that stuff he hasn't really paid a price for yet, and it starts to send a message that, well, if you can find a political benefit to doing all these things that used to be bad, then maybe they're okay to do. And assassination works that way too. And it was a problem in the Middle East, and still has been, that I'd learned in my courses at Georgetown and grad school, that assassination became a real culture there. It was the 50s or the 60s that it began, but taking out Middle East leaders. And it just went on and on with Egypt, with Jordan, you name it. So in any case, but